What is the connection between breathlessness and art? Welcome to the Possible Podcast. This is episode 4 of the first series. This is all about bringing creative thinking into arts and humanities research. I'm Paul Drury-Bradey, entrepreneur in residence, and I'm interested in community, collaboration, new connections, making ideas matter. This episode explores County Durham's industrial heritage, examining creative research into breathlessness and what this could mean for people in the region. And what does the COVID-19 age mean for the representations of breathing in literature, art, and across popular culture? These ideas are rooted in the Life of Breath project, incredible research into the links between art and literature and breathlessness. I spoke to Professor Jayne Macnaughton, who led the work.
Well, the Life of Breath project is funded by the Wellcome Trust, started in 2015, and it's a 5-year project to examine the experience of the symptom of breathlessness from a medical humanities perspective. And what that means is that medical humanities acknowledges that we cannot understand everything about people's experience of health or of illness through an entirely biomedical perspective. Particularly a symptom like breathlessness, which is so connected with culture, with history, with your family context, with your ethnicity, with your religious beliefs, is a really important case in point. And there's been a tendency to define the experience of breathlessness through particular means of measurement in the biomedical context, specifically spirometry. And the evidence suggests that spirometry often gets it wrong. So we were interested in the Life of Breath and taking hold of this symptom, trying to understand it in this very holistic way, this very interdisciplinary way from all these different sorts of perspectives, and trying to get at an understanding of why biomedical measurement doesn't actually reflect the true experience of this particular very distressing symptom.
We are living through uncertain times with COVID-19 seemingly changing everything. Could one of the big potential impacts from this Life of Breath research be equipping people with a new language to understand breathlessness?
Sure. I mean, one of the fascinating things that project has thrown up is that we don't have language to express our experience of breathlessness. The words just aren't there. The words have been supplied through a medical context. I'm a clinician. I don't work in respiratory medicine. I work in gynecology. But in terms of enabling people to try to express their experience of breathlessness, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons which our research has thrown up is that in culture, there's a relative invisibility of breath and breathlessness in culture, despite the fact that it's such a fundamental element of people's experience of life and death and birth. And we don't engage with the idea of breath and breathlessness very critically. So one of the things that we found in going out there and working with people who have breathlessness, particularly through the exhibition we ran, which ran in Durham and in London and also in Bristol, which was called Catch Your Breath, we ran some writer-in-residence workshops with people experiencing breathlessness, with a writer who was a poet. And it was a complete revelation because they were commenting, the people with breathlessness were commenting, this is the first opportunity they had had to actually explore and discover ways of expressing their breathlessness, which meant something to them and wasn't just words that were being supplied by the clinical context. So I think one of the problems we have in this current epidemic is that actually people talking about what breathlessness is like is still relatively absent from our discussions. People sort of emerge, you see these images of people kind of emerging in their wheelchairs from intensive care, looking slightly shell-shocked, as if they don't really quite know what's happened to them. And they certainly cannot find the words to express what this was like. And I think one of the responsibilities of our project and one of the responsibilities of the arts and humanities in relation to this is to try to do something about that, to try to provide metaphors, images, ideas, ways in which people can talk about this symptom so that, in part, actually, they can understand themselves and their experience better, which has been a problem, but also so that they can communicate that more effectively to healthcare givers.
Another big research impact is rooted in the region's industrial heritage. I asked Jayne about the power of doing this research here in County Durham.
Yeah, that was really critical. What was very interesting, one of our key focuses was this condition, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And of course, in Durham, with its mining heritage, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is associated with, yes, with coal mining, with heavy degrees of smoking, with social deprivation, is a really critical condition here. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is about to become the third biggest killer globally, largely because of smoking, but also because in certain developing countries, also because of the use of indoor cooking fires. But air pollution is another big issue. But in historical terms, in County Durham and in Northumberland, in this area, it's very much a legacy of coal mining, but also the fact that we have a high proportion of people living in socially deprived communities. And this really struck us very forcibly because in our region in the northeast, we have 4 out of the 10 so-called hotspots in the country for COPD. That's as measured by the British Lung Foundation, with whom we've worked quite closely. And that really struck us because the outcome of that was these communities of people who have COPD, they are relatively powerless. They are older people, they are ill, but they feel a high degree of shame and stigma in relation to their condition. This is one of the really striking things about living with breathlessness, is that people feel ashamed of having it because they feel they're judged by people, in that many of them have smoked and their condition is as a result of having smoked or having sometimes worked in heavy industry, but often the two things go together. And these people feel a high degree of shame and stigma, and therefore don't do anything about it, don't push for better resources of funding or better resources of support or better resources of funding for research. I mean, the proportion of funding that's given to research for respiratory disease is a fraction of that given to heart disease, which, strangely enough, although heart disease is also associated with smoking, it's also sort of something that just sort of strikes you out of nowhere. Some of our most famous politicians, like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, have suffered from heart disease, though they've not been smokers. But these people who suffer from conditions like COPD are amongst the most deprived in our community, and they do not feel self-actualized. They don't feel they can make a fuss about it. And so we've got to make a fuss for them. That's really an important issue. And actually, one of the things we tried to do, but this was rather, well, actually, it was scuppered a bit by the Brexit controversy. We contacted the all-party parliamentary group for respiratory health, and the person who is the chair of that, Jim Shannon, who's the MP who's from Northern Ireland. We went down to meet with Jim, and he offered us the opportunity to host a symposium in the Houses of Parliament. And we'd organised this for November, I think it was the 20th of November, which was World COPD Day. And of course, that was right in the midst of all the big Brexit controversy, the election. So unfortunately, that never took place. And of course, we're now into lockdown, so we're not going to be able to do that. But we felt it was absolutely critical that we acted as a project to go and try to raise awareness of this lack of funding, particularly for research into respiratory disease. The figures are astonishing. The British Lung Foundation brought out a report called The Battle for Breath a couple of years back. And in that report, they indicated that there have been significant improvements over the last decade in mortality from heart disease, but absolutely none at all for respiratory disease. And at the back of this is a lack of research funding and support.
The research uncovered new knowledge about chronic illnesses, and also how to use culture, movement and fun to tackle some of the complex issues.
One of the problems with having a chronic illness, particularly something like breathlessness, is that you become begin to feel that your body is a burden, that it's something that you cannot have any pleasure out of, that it's something you don't want to do anything with. You'd rather one of our patients just said, I feel safest if I'm just sitting in my armchair. I don't want to do anything. So if you want to get people moving again, and the reason why pulmonary rehabilitation is important is because you're exercising the lungs, just like any of us. You're exercising the lungs, you're improving your lung function. Well, we thought, can we get people doing exercise that sort of expresses their own language, dance being something everyone understands, that it's culturally appropriate, so it revives people's memories of their youthful days in dance clubs and going out on a Friday night, and also gets them in touch with their bodies again. So we did a pilot study in Darlington with our group there, and as well as doing measurements of their exercise tolerance and of their balance and their strength. When we looked at the results of this, we discovered that people's strength and balance had improved, and also they found it a lot of fun. They didn't really realize they were exercising because they were just enjoying themselves so much. And as well as just enjoying themselves as individuals, they were enjoying themselves as a group together. And working together was motivating them to do more.
I decided to speak to Arthur Rose, a postdoc on the Life of Breath project. I'm really interested in intersectionalities and people with big ideas working together in new ways. So I asked Arthur if there were any unique challenges from working across medicine, science, art and literature.
Great question. Yes, it is a constant challenge. Well, the problem is that people come in and say that they feel wheezy, but in medicine, wheeze has a very specific meaning. And what they're meaning when they're saying that they feel wheezy isn't this sort of specific condition of wheeze. It is something far more broad, and it may shift from person to person to person. And this was sort of phrased to us, what would be great is to work out how the humanities can correct the public perception about that, and how the humanities might change people's thinking about the word wheeze. Now, obviously, to try and change the behavior of 60 million people odd, just to think about the UK, is, as we're finding in this particular moment, incredibly difficult. Whereas what we thought would be a more germane solution to the problem is that you start to get clinicians to think about why it is that they have a certain set of expectations about what wheeze is, because they've had training, because there's a set of knowledge assumptions, and how they might position themselves in relation to other people's ignorance in such a way that doesn't mean that the person who comes in to say that they're wheezy is wrong, or the physician is more right for having this more exacting definition of wheeze.
Keen to learn more about this research, I asked Arthur to tell me more about new ways of exploring English language in this context.
In a sense, what the real challenge was always to do with working with language, working with words that were the same, but which meant very, very different things. So, for instance, in the arts and humanities, to talk about breath is often a very enabling thing. It indexes a wide variety of different conditions. It indexes spirit. It indexes patterns of inspiration. I mean, inspiration itself comes from to breathe in. Whereas in medicine, to breathe normally is what you want to aspire to. Again, another word that has heavy breath connotations. And in fact, as soon as you start to think about breathing, you're probably thinking about it in a more pathological sense. So part of the idea of the project was really to address that challenge by thinking about how breath can be positive and be negative. And that was, in a sense, also what Life of Breath was all about. Obviously, the kind of more local day-to-day challenges were, again, when you're starting to work with words that you both assume the other person understands, but in fact might have very, very different connotations for, you then run into all sorts of very strange hiccups, productive hiccups, in the way in which you write together, in the way in which you might reference things together. And in sense, the nitty-gritty of interdisciplinary work is really where the challenge lies, even though it doesn't feel like it, because we're all, as academics, we train ourselves to write in certain ways. We train ourselves to certain habits of research, and to try and unpick those habits can be quite painful. And so, in a sense, what the challenge of working across disciplines involves is the often quite painful picking of certain habits of thinking, certain assumptions of thinking that allow us to communicate maybe more clearly.
After hearing Arthur's academic perspective, I wanted to get an understanding of the creative practice involved in the project. So I chatted to Life of Breath visual artist Jayne Wilton.
My role on the Life of Breath project was as a collaborator, bringing insights into making the breath visible. and also in broadening my own practice through insights from the rich array of really amazing team members. One of the really amazing parts of the Life of Breath project for me was the ability to research the history of breath in art, which I presented as a lecture and a chapter in the forthcoming book for the Life of Breath project. Of course, breathlessness isn't always about pathological breathlessness. Quite often in art, it's actually been portrayed for reasons such as, in my own practice, I've investigated breath withholding in yoga practice and recording that photographically. Some artists have looked at people who hold their breath. For example, Thompson Craighead produced a 5-triptych piece of work taken from 61,000 YouTube videos of people holding their breath underwater. So the people hold their breath, and that's sort of interesting culturally to see why people do that.
Jayne explained that working with Durham University researchers and a wider project team opened up a whole new world of perspectives on her work.
The major thing that I learned from the Life of Breath project was quite how much alchemy can emerge from a group of interdisciplinary people who are all engaged in having the best possible outcomes, not leaving any stone unturned, and cooperating on a level playing field. It really was a feeling that everybody was equal within the team and everybody brought something really relevant to the group's work. And I've worked on interdisciplinary projects before, and I've never felt such a buzz of sort of support and willingness to succeed. So I think that's one of the major things I learned from the project. I also, in my own practice, I learned an awful lot from listening to philosophical concepts and insights, anthropological, looking more into literature. I feel my own practice is really being enriched by this wealth of information and investigation in other functions. I was also really interested to see how existing pieces of my work were viewed by people with breathlessness and how interested people were in looking at how other people's breath looks like and also engaging with processes to capture their own breath. So, for example, all of the workshops we did in relation to the exhibitions, they were very, very satisfying in terms of the level of engagement. People really wanted to see their breath, like, what does my breath look like? And it really created some major dialogue and so much engagement through the exhibitions in Durham, the Royal College of Physicians, and in Bristol, really bringing people in and allowing them to voice their feelings about the breath, see some unexpected literary sources, visual images, sculptural works, vocal pieces, the richness of sensory and proprioceptive resources that were brought into all of the public engagement programs was really, really fulfilling.
Jayne's really excited about the future impact of the Life of Breath project, particularly with COVID-19 bringing respiratory illnesses and issues to the forefront of the news agenda.
I think we're exploring new ways of working, and I think the Life of Breath project has pioneered bringing centres of excellence together across the country, and this obviously will extend to around the world. I think the fact that centres of excellence have worked across 2 very geographically dispersed areas and brought in collaborators from many other dispersed parts of the country. It does seem relevant that for the past 5 years we've been trying to increase awareness of lungs, and here we are with everybody, the whole international forum, everybody's looking at lungs, and hopefully the resources that have been generated can be taken up after this.
After understanding just some of the impact from Life of Breath, I wanted to get a feel for County Durham's mining and industrial heritage and how this long and proud history intersected with breathing problems, but also with a unique cultural perspective. So I spoke to Paul Summers, an artist, writer and poet with Durham mining heritage in his family.
You've got a version of the North and a version of Durham and Northumberland that exists in Bernicia and in Northumbria, and when Northumbria was the sort of intellectual hub of the world. But then I suppose the stuff that impacts into my life more is that the dying embers of industrialisation. It was always going to be impossible for the heavy industry not to leave its mark, either a scar or a tattoo, in some way on anyone who lived through the last 60, 70 years, I suppose. And just as I was reaching my teen years was the final decline of the coal industry and the shipbuilding. So I kind of just caught a parting glimpse of what had been heavy industry in the north. And then I'd spent the next 35 years wondering about how we're going to deal with post-industrialisation.
I asked Paul if there's something specific about mining and how it affected people and breathing, particularly in how it shapes the form of both poetry and writing.
I think the language itself, the language of the pitmatic, if you like, that was sort of this hybrid of Cornish and Scots and Irish and a little bit of old Durham and Yorkshire and a little bit of Cleveland and a little bit of Northumbria and a little bit of Scots. That in itself has got a beautiful sound, a beautiful music. So I think that fed into some of the writing. I also think the sort of brusqueness and the honesty and the sort of no bullshit sort of approach to things as well probably seeps into some modern writing. I mean, I think you have to be careful, because I think lots of people will write romantically about industrialisation. Lots of people will almost place it in a sort of halcyon age. I think you also have to remember that there has to be a nod to how hard and how fearsome and how dangerous a lot of it was as well, and how much residual trauma, I suppose, it leaves on families, the ghosts that industrialisation left behind. So I think all of those things appear in lots of the writing that I like, and I think in some of my writing as well.
I asked Paul to share some of his poetry.
Yeah, well, there's an old poem. This is from a book called The Last Bus, which was produced in the mid to late 90s, I think. It's really about my little mining town, my little hometown, and how it was dealing with those changes that I've just talked to you about, the sort of death of its industry and the death of its labour supply. So anyway, it's just called North, Home Thoughts from Abroad. We are more than sharply contrasting photographs of massive ships and stays for coal, more than crackling films where grimy-faced workers are dwarfed by shadows or emitted by chimneys, more than foul-mouthed men in smoky clubs or well-built women in a wash-day chorus. We're more than lessons in post-industrial sociology, more than just case studies of dysfunctional community. We are more than non-speaking extras in fashionable new gangster movies, more than sad lyrics in exile songs. We are more than the backbone of inglorious empire or the stubborn old heart of a dying beast. We are more than the ghosts of a million histories, more than legends inscribed in blood, more than exhibits in some vast museum or the unbought remnants of a year-long sale. We are more than this, but not much more.
Paul said Durham University research on the unique language and culture of the North East is so important, but more could be done to truly understand our region's heritage and shared way of being.
Well, I think there's already been a little bit of a cultural movement toward trying to capture and value some of the working class voices who have been documenting stuff for years, but haven't really found a way through the cultural glass ceiling. So that in itself is quite interesting. You know, like I think people have finally realised that class needs to be included in our list of diversity subjects. So I think it will happen, and I think the idea around, I would like to see more of an exploration of masculinity as well. I think we're still, in my experience anyway, still relatively underdeveloped in terms of our reformed version of masculinity. And I think that needs to be explored. I suppose it'll be explored in the broader context of gender. But working class men need to talk a little bit about themselves. And I still don't think that, you know, like, despite we're being 30 years beyond the comprehensive schools where people like me were given an opportunity to do something, there still aren't very many voices. You know, like, I still look at the mainstream and it's still dominated by academia. It's still dominated by, well, petty bourgeois is a kind of lazy word, but they're still there. I still don't see a huge proportion of working class voices, women or men, talking about their communities and talking about the confusion of this post-industrialisation. Because in a way, it's easy to talk heritage, it's more difficult to talk the future, and I think that's what we have to embrace.
This life of breath research work is remarkable, and living and working through the COVID-19 pandemic seems like there's never been a more important time to think deeply about our language for breathlessness and respiratory illnesses. You can't look forwards without looking backwards first. That's why it's so vital to remember our region's industrial heritage. We have so much to learn about who we are today from this extraordinary Northeast history. Find out more about this by visiting lifeofbreath.org.